Hey everyone, welcome back to the vlog. My name is Brad. I vlog on the name Investing Doc. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about investing mistakes that most doctors make, most often right out of practice, or right out of residency, I should say, but not always the case. So I've made some of these mistakes myself, and let's see how many you may have made. The very first mistake I think a lot of people make is buying a house right away, right when they graduate. I actually am a big fan of home ownership. I put 5% down on my home. I used the physician loan mortgage, which ended up working out great for me. Of course, hindsight 2020 is fantastic with the property appreciation. I only put 5% down, and basically in 4 years, I've 10x'd my return on that initial down payment. Most people stay at their first job for 2 years or less. And when you buy your first house right out of training, odds are that you think it's going to last forever. You've got a lot of high hopes, and you think this is going to be just a perfect scenario for you. Unfortunately, for most physicians, that ends up not being the case. A lot of times you end up moving, something doesn't work out, you have to be closer to family, the job isn't as great as you thought it would be, whatever happens. My first job, I thought I was going to love it forever. I did love the job, but then there was a hospital takeover, another group came in, it got a little bit messy, and I decided to leave that job. If I would have bought a house for that very first job, I probably would have bought over an hour away from where I currently now work, which means I would have had to sell a house down in the south side of town, buy a house on the north side of town. It would have created a bunch of huge headaches, and yes, with the property market, I probably would have had the appreciation, but at the same time, I wouldn't have had that appreciation that I have just buying one house and staying in it a long time because the transaction costs would have eaten away at that. So for the new physicians out there, don't buy a house right out of training. Rent for your first year, even if you think you know the city. The next mistake is one that we see, I think, quite often on social media, is spending too big too early. I'm very happy for all of you that recently matched. Match day was this past week. To those who didn't, both my roommates when I was in med school didn't match. They ended up just fine in terms of finding placement after that. Yes, it was very stressful. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but at the same time, it will get better. Soon after match day, you end up getting the flood of social media postings on new cars, new boats, new houses, new trips, whatever it may be. Don't count the paycheck and don't count the money in your account until it actually hits your account. So there's nothing wrong with spending on a new car if that's what you truly want and it can fit into your budget. Just wait at least 3 paychecks in. The next problem might be a little bit controversial, but viewing all debt as bad. I think that there's a lot of people, including myself, that say, try to live as frugally as possible. You'll even hear the term thrown out, live like a resident. Yes, try to be frugal, but at the same time, life is short. We've all seen the sad diagnosis. You should live a little bit. So what do I mean by viewing all debt as bad? I'm not saying take out a loan against your 401k. What I am saying is that when you take out a loan for something, you have no idea what the future is going to hold. Who would have ever guessed that you could buy a new vehicle and a year later you could trade it back for more money than what you paid for that vehicle? The point is, no one can predict the future on what is going to happen, and buying depreciating assets long term is a losing strategy. I think that you need to split it into which debt is for a depreciating asset and which debt may be for an appreciating asset. And I wouldn't put vehicles in an appreciating asset category. That's a short-term market fluctuation that's probably never going to happen again. But what I mean is that if you're spending money, if you're investing on a house that is most likely going to appreciate over time, that's not necessarily bad debt. If you're, let's say, starting up your own practice and you're taking out a small business loan to get things started, I don't necessarily think that is bad debt, because you are spending money in order to create something in a business that is long-term sustainable for yourself. The other way to look at long-term debt is I bought the current building, or not the entire building, but I bought the space that we currently practice out of. And you could say, wow, I saddled myself with a ton of debt to be here. But at the same time, if I would have signed a 5, 7, or 10-year lease, that technically is debt on my balance sheet. Buying the space that we practice out of also means that I don't have to renegotiate lease terms, except in the future. Well, my lease is in 10 years, so I guess I have to renegotiate with myself in 10 years. But I don't have to worry about 5 years from now, what is the landlord going to do to me? Are they really going to screw me over? Not all debt is bad. If you're investing in your own company, you think it's going to grow. I'm not saying spend all of your money, but if you need a short-term loan of $50,000 to get your practice up off the ground and get it running, hey, that's not necessarily the end of the world. Definitely not as bad as taking a loan against your 401k or taking out a loan to buy a new Porsche right out of residency. The next big investing mistake that a lot of people take is taking an underpaid job. For example, Manhattan may have some relatively underpaid jobs compared to other parts of the nation just from supply and demand. And taking $125,000 a year to work in Manhattan rather than a rural part of the state or a different state entirely might actually end up hurting you long term, even if you're getting that loan repayment, if you can make better connections, if you can make more money somewhere else. Because you never know what's going to happen 10 years from now. What if the government decides not to continue this program? What if they end up taxing you in one form or another? I personally would just go for making the most money up front and trying to pay your loans off by yourself if you can. There's a couple exceptions to that. If you have a very high student loan balance, let's say you have over $500,000 and you really need the student loan forgiveness, unfortunately, you might be stuck and you might have to go for jobs like that. Another investment mistake that a lot of physicians make is burning themselves out by working too hard. I was a hospitalist myself before I switched over to outpatient medicine. In ways to build up financially for my office, I ended up working every week on and week off in the hospital. And then on my weeks off and the weekends off, I would drive 4 hours away and I would do locums pretty much every single week off. So I didn't have almost any days off for over 6 months. You'll see some people online kind of tout the benefits. I made $500,000 doing hospitals, working 28 days a month. It's not sustainable. They're going to burn themselves out. You'd rather go for the marathon, not the race. Don't burn yourself out. You're going to end up hating your life. You're going to end up hating the career. And in the long term, you're probably going to make a bad investment decision by blowing all of your energy working so hard and not spreading it out over time. Along those lines, the next mistake kind of ties into that previous mistake, which is chronic employment fatigue. We've all known those physicians that switch jobs every 2 years. When you switch jobs every couple of years, you don't build up any longevity with a certain practice. You have to pay malpractice costs a lot of times when you switch from one job to another. You may not be able to buy into partnership if they offer partnership, because usually you have to be there 2 to 3 years before you can buy into partnership. Switching from job to job every 2 to 3 years is a huge investment mistake if you're not cutting your losses early. If you know this job isn't for you, there's no point in staying around. Give a job a reasonable amount of time, but if you know the job isn't for you, move on to something else. The last investment mistake that a lot of physicians make is not thinking like a business person. Let's use a parallel that my family was in before I got into medicine, because I'm the only physician in my family. Plumbing. We'll talk about plumbers. For plumbers, you have to work your way up the totem pole of skills to where you eventually become a master plumber. There's journeyman. There's of course, apprentice it starts with. There's all different levels of skills and certifications that you can go along your way to become a plumber. Once you're fully certified on your own to be your own plumber, at a certain point, you have to look back, and a lot of these plumbers do, and say, why am I making so much money for someone else? I should just go hang my hat, put a shingle somewhere up, and say, look, I'm going to open my own plumbing company. As a physician, your license to practice medicine is the biggest thing for you. You can literally take that license, you can go rent a space somewhere else, and you can become your own business, your own practice, not quite overnight, but pretty close to it. Acting like you have no say in your financial and your employment future when you are fully licensed and fully accredited to do your own thing is one of the worst mistakes you can make to think of. I think it's one of the worst mistakes that physicians can make. Now, there's something to be said. Not everyone wants to be their own boss. Not everyone wants the headache of running a practice. Some people just want to come in, collect a paycheck, work at a good job, and leave. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, once you feel like you're being taken advantage of and that basically people are using your license, using you, and making a ton of money off of you, yeah, it is hard. There are a lot of legalities and lots of loopholes to kind of do your own thing. And it is hard to probably be, for example, an oncology physician and open up your own oncology practice, because it's hard to get those referrals. It's hard to have those connections for infusion clinics. So I get that there's lots of exceptions to this where it's not so easy. However, your license is your biggest factor in arguing with your employer and arguing with yourself if you're not happy with your current situation, to say, screw it, I'm just going to go do my own thing. Those are the quick investing mistakes that a lot of people make, and I've made a lot of them myself. So hope you all have a nice day. Consider subscribing, following along. Have a good one.